My parents tried to legally evict me to hand my dream home over to my golden child brother. When that failed, they snatched my wife, aggressively claiming they were protecting her. I am not sure if I am looking for advice or if I just need to get this poison out of my system. My name is Gavin. I am 28 years old now, and I have spent the vast majority of my life trying to understand why I was treated like a ghost in my own childhood home. It is a very difficult thing to describe to people who grew up with normal, loving parents. You watch movies and see families fighting, but underneath the arguments, there is always this baseline of unconditional love. I never had that. I suppose I have always known that my family did not really love me, at least not in the way that parents are supposed to love their child. The root of the issue, or perhaps just the most obvious symptom of it, is my brother Carter. Carter is 21 years old now, meaning there is a 7-year age gap between us. 7 years is a massive divide when you are a kid. It is enough of a distance that we never truly had the chance to be playmates, but it goes much deeper than that. From the absolute second he was brought home from the hospital, I ceased to exist. I could tell even as a young boy that he was the absolute center of my parents' universe. I was just the background scenery, and he was the golden child. The older I get, and the more I reflect on those years, the more I realize how fundamentally messed up my reality was. For a long time, I tried to convince myself that I was just being a dramatic teenager, or that I was misremembering things because of jealousy. But the memories are too sharp. Take Christmas, for example. Christmas is supposed to be the most magical time of the year for a kid, but for me, it was always an annual reminder of my exact place in the family hierarchy. Let me take you back to a specific Christmas. The living room was completely covered in torn wrapping paper. My mother, Catherine, and my father, Douglas, were sitting on the floor, their eyes entirely fixed on Carter. The enthusiasm in that room was suffocating, and it was entirely directed at him. Carter, who was acting like a ferocious little animal, ripped the paper off a massive box. It was a brand new PlayStation 5, accompanied by extra controllers, a premium headset, and every single top-tier game a kid could possibly want. My parents were cheering, taking pictures, laughing as Carter screamed in excitement. And then there was me. I was sitting on the edge of the sofa, trying to make myself as small as possible. In my hands, I held my present. It was not a console. It was not a video game. It was a plastic packet of basic, white athletic socks from Walmart. 6 pairs. I am not joking. I am not exaggerating for sympathy. That was my only gift. The socks themselves did not actually matter to me. I was older, I could buy my own clothes, and I could survive without fancy gifts. But what destroyed me inside was the blatant, unapologetic inequality. As my brother celebrated his expensive haul, everyone totally disregarded me. I sat there with this pathetic, phony smile plastered on my face, feeling my chest tighten with a familiar, heavy ache. I thanked my mother for the socks. She gave me a tight, brief nod without even making eye contact, before immediately turning her attention back to Carter to ask him which game he was going to play first. That was not an isolated incident. That was the blueprint for my entire life. The blatant favoritism extended to everything, especially birthdays. To tell you the truth, my parents did not even really acknowledge my birthday until I was about 10 years old. And even then, it was treated like a chore they had been forced to complete. For my 10th birthday, we had cold pizza at the kitchen table. There were no decorations, no friends invited, no music. Just a cardboard box of pepperoni pizza that my dad picked up on his way home from work. And I remember considering myself incredibly fortunate just to get that. But then, a few years later, Carter turned 10. My parents transformed our entire house into a ludicrous, immersive pirate adventure theme. They rented costumes, built a fake ship in the backyard, hired an entertainer, and organized an elaborate treasure hunt for him and 30 of his classmates. I was told to stay in my room so I would not ruin the aesthetic or get in the way of the guests. But the memory that truly cemented my complete lack of value in their eyes was my high school graduation. Graduating is a major milestone. You spend 4 years grinding through classes, dealing with the stress of exams, and you look forward to that one day where you get to walk across the stage and hear your family cheer. The graduation ceremony was held on a sweltering afternoon in the middle of June. The football field was packed. I sat in the rows of folding chairs with my classmates, wiping sweat from my forehead, scanning the bleachers. I saw thousands of proud parents holding up signs, waving balloons, and snapping photos. I looked at the section where my parents had promised they would be sitting. The seats were completely empty. I sat there for 3 hours. I heard my name called. I walked across the stage. I took my diploma. The principal shook my hand. And there was absolute silence from the crowd because the two people who were supposed to be there cheering for me were miles away. When I finally took the bus home that evening, still wearing my graduation gown, I found my parents sitting in the living room watching television. I asked them why they did not come. My mother, Catherine, did not even mute the TV. She casually mentioned that Carter had woken up with a slight sniffle that morning. Not a fever. Not a serious illness. A minor sniffle. She said he was feeling a bit cranky, so they decided it was best for the family to stay home and keep him comfortable. They ordered takeout for him. They did not save me any. I went up to my tiny, cramped bedroom, took off my graduation gown, folded it neatly, and placed it in the trash can. I realized right then that I was nothing more than an extra, a secondary character randomly placed in the movie of Carter's life. The constant reminder that I was not the favorite, and that I never would be, was a poison that slowly infected my entire worldview. You might think I was always bitter, but I honestly recall being ecstatic when Carter was born. I assumed we would play video games together, build forts, and hang around like the loyal brothers you see in movies. But as we grew up, I quickly discovered that Carter had absolutely zero interest in me. He had all he could possibly want: his friends, his premium sports equipment, his parents' undivided worship. I became deeply resentful of him, but at first, I tried to convince myself it was not his fault. He was just a kid being spoiled. But soon enough, Carter began to recognize his supreme authority in the house. He realized he could do absolutely no wrong in the eyes of my parents. And more dangerously, he realized that I was the perfect, permanent scapegoat. The final straw, the moment I essentially gave up on my family forever, happened when I was 16. We had a massive, incredibly expensive flat-screen television in the living room. It was my dad's pride and joy. One Saturday afternoon, Carter had a friend over. They were roughhousing, throwing a heavy indoor basketball around the living room despite the strict rules against it. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my homework, completely minding my own business. Suddenly, I heard a massive crash. I ran into the living room to see the giant TV knocked completely off its stand. The screen shattered into a million spiderweb cracks on the hardwood floor. Carter and his friend were standing there, frozen in panic. 10 minutes later, the front door unlocked, and my parents walked in. Douglas saw the destroyed television, and his face turned bright red. Before he could even formulate a sentence, Carter pointed a trembling finger directly at me. With a perfectly rehearsed, tearful voice, Carter said that I had lost my temper, thrown a book at him, missed, and smashed the TV. I was stunned. I immediately started defending myself, explaining that I was in the kitchen the entire time, that Carter was playing with a basketball. I begged them to look at the basketball sitting right next to the broken glass. But my parents did not even look. They did not ask for my side of the story. My father marched over to me, grabbed my arm aggressively, and dragged me upstairs. They completely ignored the physical evidence because it did not align with their delusion that Carter was a perfect angel. They confiscated my phone, grounded me to my bedroom for an entire month, and treated me with such intense disgust you would think I was a convicted criminal. Meanwhile, Carter sat downstairs watching a movie on his iPad, drinking hot chocolate my mother made to calm his nerves. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling for hours that night. I stopped crying. The sadness evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard realization. There was no justice here. There was no love. I began to isolate myself completely, spending every possible moment planning my escape from the prison of my own family. I will always remember the morning of my 18th birthday. I had spent the last 2 years quietly fading into the background, working part-time jobs after school and hoarding every single dollar I made. When I came downstairs that morning, it was just another typical day. Carter was aggressively mashing buttons on his Xbox. My dad, Douglas, was reading a sports magazine, and Catherine was wiping down the kitchen counters. No one looked up. No one said happy birthday. Not a single card or cheap cupcake. It confirmed everything I already knew. I walked straight out the front door with a large duffel bag containing everything I owned. I did not leave a dramatic note. I just left. I moved into a tiny, claustrophobic studio apartment across town. It was the cheapest place I could find, and it showed. The walls were paper-thin, the radiator hissed like a dying animal all night, and there was a permanent smell of dampness and mold lingering in the bathroom. But to me, it felt like an absolute paradise because it was mine. I did not have to walk on eggshells. However, freedom is incredibly expensive. I began working as a freelance graphic designer on the website Fiverr to cover my rent and groceries. At first, it was brutal. I was charging $5 for logos, staying awake until 4 in the morning to finish projects for clients on the other side of the world. I survived on cheap ramen noodles and instant coffee. There is one specific night from that era that still haunts me. About 6 months after I moved out, I developed a severe tooth infection. A wisdom tooth was coming in sideways, and it had become terribly infected. By the second day, my entire left cheek was swollen to the size of a golf ball. The throbbing, shooting pain was so excruciating it made my vision blur. I had no health insurance, no savings left for that month, and absolutely no money for a dentist. I sat on the stained mattress on the floor of my moldy apartment, holding a bag of frozen peas against my face, shivering from a fever. I looked at my phone. I could have called my parents. I could have begged them for help, just a couple of $100 to get the tooth pulled. But as I stared at Catherine's name in my contacts, I knew exactly how the call would go. She would sigh, tell me how inconvenient my timing was, complain about how expensive Carter's new soccer cleats were, and ultimately hang up on me. I put the phone down. I bit into a piece of sterile gauze and just endured the blinding pain alone in the dark for 4 days until the infection finally broke. It was the loneliest I have ever felt, but surviving that toothache taught me a valuable lesson. I was my only safety net. I could never, ever rely on my blood relatives. The relentless grind eventually started to pay off. As I gained more customers and established a flawless 5-star reputation, my freelance gig grew into a legitimate business. I started taking on major branding contracts. And then, when I was 22, I met Claire. Claire was incredible. She was a social media manager for small local businesses, and we connected online to collaborate on a marketing campaign for a client. We met for coffee to discuss the project, and we ended up talking for 5 hours. She was intelligent, fiercely ambitious, and had this warm, genuine energy that immediately disarmed me. We started working together frequently, seamlessly blending her marketing skills with my design work. But more importantly, Claire was the very first person in my entire life who actually saw me. She did not look right through me. When I spoke, she listened with complete focus. When I accomplished something, she celebrated it genuinely. Because of my childhood, I suffered from a massive case of imposter syndrome. Even when I was making good money, I lived in constant fear that I was a fraud, that I was inherently worthless, and that tomorrow I would lose everything and end up homeless. Claire patiently dismantled those fears brick by brick. She loved me for exactly who I was, not for what I could do for her. About a year into our relationship, Claire took me to meet her parents for Thanksgiving. I was absolutely terrified. I expected cold judgment, subtle insults, and a chaotic atmosphere. Instead, her parents welcomed me at the door with massive hugs. Her mother asked me questions about my design work and actually cared about the answers. Her father joked around with me and handed me a beer. We sat around a large dining table, eating amazing food, laughing, and sharing stories. There was no golden child. There was no scapegoat. There was just a family. Sitting at that table, watching Claire smile across from me, I felt a physical weight lift off my chest. It was the cure for my lifelong invisibility. Our careers continued to flourish, our combined income skyrocketed, and we officially moved in together, building a beautiful, quiet life far away from the toxic shadow of my past. By the time I turned 25, Claire and I were incredibly successful. We had built a boutique digital agency from the ground up, and we decided it was time to put down permanent roots. Our crazy plan was to combine all of our savings and purchase a massive house. We searched the suburbs for months before we finally found the perfect location. It was a gorgeous, 3-story home with a huge backyard, hardwood floors, and giant windows that let in natural light all day. It was far more than I ever imagined I could afford when I was sitting in that moldy apartment eating dry noodles. But our combined income made it easily possible. The day we signed the closing papers and held the heavy metal keys in our hands, we popped open a bottle of champagne on the empty living room floor. This house was our fortress. It was living proof that I did not need my toxic family to survive. But while Claire and I were building an empire, a very different story was unfolding across the state in my childhood home. While I was 25 and buying a mansion, Carter was now 18 years old. He had recently graduated from high school with terrible grades, possessing absolutely no life skills, no work ethic, and no desire to get a job. He still lived at home, playing video games all day while Douglas and Catherine funded his lifestyle. But Carter made a massive mistake. He got his 18-year-old high school girlfriend, Brooke, pregnant. I found out through the family grapevine. The golden child had ruined his life before it even started. Brooke had no money, Carter had no job, and neither of them had any prospect of moving out. Suddenly, the perfect, carefully constructed fantasy world my parents had built around Carter was collapsing. They were facing the reality of having a screaming newborn baby in their house, supported entirely by their aging bank accounts. Douglas and Catherine were in a complete state of panic. They needed a solution to save Carter from the consequences of his own actions. And unfortunately, right around that exact same time, through a nosy extended relative, my parents discovered that their forgotten scapegoat son had just purchased a massive, luxurious 3-story home in the suburbs. The stage was set for the most insane, audacious collision of my life. If you are enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments which city you're watching from. Every single comment helps the video reach more people, and I truly appreciate your support. Now, let's get back to the nightmare. We had only been living in the new house for 3 days. There were still cardboard boxes stacked in the dining room, and we were still trying to figure out which light switches operated which rooms. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Claire and I were painting the guest bedroom when my phone started buzzing on the floor. I wiped a streak of blue paint off my forehead and looked at the screen. It was Catherine, my mother. I had not spoken to her in several months, and the few times we had interacted over the past few years had been awkward, stiff, and usually ended with me quietly hanging up. But for some inexplicable reason, a fleeting moment of weakness perhaps, I swiped to answer. Her voice came through the speaker, and it was entirely wrong. It was overly bright, dripping with a sickly sweet tone that immediately put my stomach in knots. She chirped about being in the neighborhood and thought it would be lovely to stop by and see the new house. I should have known better. I should have sensed the trap. I lived nearly 2 hours away from them. They were never just in the neighborhood. But I reasoned that if I let them visit for 20 minutes, they would see that I was doing well, maybe feel a twinge of pride, and then leave me alone for another year. I gave her the address. A few hours later, a silver SUV pulled into our long driveway. I opened the front door, expecting just my parents. Instead, 4 people walked up my porch steps. My dad, Douglas, marched in first, looking around with a deeply critical squint. My mother followed, holding a cheap bottle of wine. Behind them was my younger brother, Carter, looking as arrogant and bored as ever. And clinging to his arm was a girl I had never met before. It was Brooke, Carter's 18-year-old girlfriend. And she was very visibly pregnant. Nobody had bothered to inform me that my brother was going to be a father. The discomfort started the second they stepped into the foyer. Douglas did not congratulate me. He looked up at the high ceiling, scoffed, and immediately started making passive-aggressive comments about how surprised he was that I could afford something like this, implying heavily that I must be buried in irresponsible debt. Catherine tried to strike up a forced, agonizingly fake conversation with Claire in the kitchen, but Claire is sharp. She immediately sensed the hostility and kept looking over at me with raised eyebrows. Meanwhile, Carter and Brooke were taking a self-guided tour of my house. I caught them walking out of the master bedroom. Brooke was literally pointing at the walls, loudly discussing with Carter what color they should paint the trim, acting as if she were a prospective buyer rather than an uninvited guest. The air in the house grew thick with an unspoken, incredibly dark agenda. My dad signaled for everyone to gather in the living room. He stood in the center of the room, puffed out his chest, and prepared to drop a bomb that would permanently destroy whatever microscopic shred of family tied us together. Douglas did not bother asking us to sit down. He stood next to the fireplace, folded his arms across his chest, and cleared his throat. He put on this authoritative, patronizing voice, the exact same voice he used to use when he grounded me for things Carter had done. He announced, completely deadpan, that he and Catherine had been discussing the situation, and they had come to a family decision. He stated that since Carter and Brooke were starting a family and desperately needed space for the new baby, it made the most logical sense for them to move into this house. I stood there, holding a half-empty glass of water, absolutely certain I had misheard him. I asked him to repeat himself. Douglas rolled his eyes, looking incredibly annoyed that he had to explain something so simple to me. He elaborated. He told me that this house was far too large for just Claire and me. We did not have children, so we did not need a backyard or 3 bedrooms. He explained that a location like this, in a safe suburban neighborhood with good schools, would be highly beneficial for Carter to raise his child. Therefore, Douglas concluded, Claire and I needed to pack up our things, find a smaller apartment somewhere else, and hand the keys over to Carter. My brain completely short-circuited. I looked at my mother, expecting her to laugh and say it was a terrible joke. She just smiled, nodding in agreement with my dad. I looked at Carter. He had this smug, entitled smirk plastered across his face. He actually had the nerve to chime in, telling me to come on, be a good brother, and step aside because he was a parent now and his needs came first. I felt like I was being gaslit on a cosmic level. I firmly reminded my father that my name and Claire's name were on the deed. We paid the massive down payment. We secured the mortgage. He could not just walk into my property and reassign it to his favorite son like it was a hand-me-down sweater. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He stepped closer to me, aggressively invading my personal space. He told me I was being selfish and ungrateful. He said I owed the family for raising me, and that blood comes before everything else. Then, he delivered a line that I will never forget. He pointed a thick finger at my chest and told me that I should be highly appreciative that they were coming to me to ask nicely, rather than just legally forcing me to give up the property. He genuinely, delusionally believed that because he was the patriarch of the family, he had eminent domain over everything I owned. He demanded the house for his golden child, and he expected me to just bow my head and comply. The sheer audacity of his demand broke something inside of me. 2 decades of bottled-up animosity, the unfair punishments, the ignored birthdays, the Walmart socks, the moldy apartment, every single memory of neglect came rushing to the surface in a blinding wave of pure rage. I did not raise my voice. I completely lost my mind. I screamed at them to get out of my house. I told Douglas that just because Carter had ruined his life by knocking up his teenage girlfriend did not give them the right to steal my life to fix his mistakes. Douglas did not like being spoken to like that. He was so used to me being the quiet, submissive punching bag. In an attempt to physically intimidate me, he lunged forward and forcefully shoved me hard in the chest, pushing me back into the drywall. That was his fatal mistake. The adrenaline exploded in my veins. I shoved him back much harder. He stumbled over a moving box and crashed into the coffee table. Instantly, the living room devolved into absolute chaos. Carter jumped in, trying to throw a punch at my jaw. I ducked and tackled my brother to the hardwood floor. We were engaged in a full-on, violent brawl in the middle of my brand-new living room, hurling punches and screaming decades worth of curses at one another. Over the sound of breaking glass and heavy breathing, I could hear the women. Catherine was shrieking in pure panic. Claire was yelling at the top of her lungs for them to get the hell out of her home. In the corner, Brooke, terrified by the violence, had pulled out her phone and dialed emergency services. We did not stop fighting until the heavy boots of the local police officers came stomping through my front door. The cops immediately separated us. Because I was standing over Carter with a bleeding lip when they walked in, and because Douglas and Catherine were hysterically screaming that I had attacked them unprovoked, the officers put my hands behind my back. I was handcuffed. In the house I had just bought. I was shoved into the back of a police cruiser while my neighbors watched from their lawns. I sat in a cold, concrete holding cell at the local precinct for 4 hours. As I stared at the rusted metal bars, touching the swelling bruise on my cheek, the reality washed over me. My own father had invaded my home, attempted to steal my property for his favorite son, and then played the victim to get me arrested. When Claire finally came to the station to bail me out later that evening, I did not cry. The sadness was completely gone. The family tie was officially, irreparably severed. They had drawn first blood, and I was no longer going to play defense. In his unending, delusional brilliance, my father actually followed through on his threat. A week after the physical altercation, I was served with legal papers. Douglas had officially hired a lawyer and filed a frivolous lawsuit against me, claiming that I had somehow coerced them out of financial support and that the house should be placed in a family trust for Carter. It was a completely baseless, legally hollow threat designed purely to bankrupt me through attorney fees and force me to surrender. But the legal attack was only half the battle. Catherine took the war to social media. She posted a massive, multi-paragraph essay on Facebook, tagging every single aunt, uncle, and cousin in our extended family. She spun a horrific, fabricated narrative. She claimed that I had secretly developed a severe drug addiction, that I had stolen their retirement savings to buy my mansion, and that when they tried to stage an intervention, I violently assaulted my father and pregnant brother's girlfriend. The response was immediate and sickening. My phone blew up with hateful text messages from relatives I had not spoken to in years, calling me a monster, a disgrace, and demanding I apologize to my parents. Instead of cowering in a corner, I went on the offensive. I used a significant chunk of my business savings to hire the most ruthless, highly rated civil defense attorney I could find. I sat in her office and told her I did not just want to dismiss the case, I wanted to completely obliterate them. My lawyer and I spent weeks compiling a massive arsenal of evidence. I had bank statements proving I never took a dime from them. I had the police report from the brawl, which noted that Douglas admitted to shoving me first. But more importantly, I dug deep into my digital archives. I pulled up over a decade of emails, text messages, and voicemails. I found the messages where Catherine refused to help me with my medical emergencies. I found the texts where Douglas called me worthless. I even tracked down my old childhood neighbors who were willing to sign sworn affidavits detailing the blatant emotional neglect and psychological abuse they witnessed growing up. We took all of it, bundled it together, and filed a massive countersuit against Douglas and Catherine for severe psychological and emotional damages, harassment, and defamation. I was done being the victim. The lawsuit dragged out for nearly a year. I was 26 by the time we actually sat in a courtroom for the final hearings. Sitting across the aisle from the people who raised me was a surreal, out-of-body experience. Douglas wore a cheap suit and did everything he could to paint himself as a devoted, loving patriarch who was just trying to keep his family off the streets. Carter and Brooke sat behind him, performing their roles perfectly. They looked down at the floor, playing the part of the innocent, terrified young parents who were being bullied by a greedy, wealthy older brother. However, a courtroom is not a family dinner table. Gaslighting does not work when you are under oath facing a judge who demands hard evidence. My attorney systematically dismantled their entire narrative. She presented the deed to my house, my immaculate financial records, and then she read my mother's unhinged text messages aloud for the public record. The judge, an older, no-nonsense man, looked at my parents with absolute disgust. He saw right through the delusion. The final verdict was the most satisfying moment of my entire existence. The judge slammed his gavel down and completely threw out Douglas's lawsuit, citing it as entirely without merit. But he did not stop there. Ruling on my countersuit, the judge firmly stated that the documented history of abuse and the recent defamatory actions were reprehensible. He ordered my father to pay me $120,000 in damages. The color completely drained from Douglas's face. That settlement was essentially their entire remaining life savings. The fallout was nuclear. Because my parents had to liquidate their assets to pay the court order, their financial stability collapsed overnight. They could no longer fund Carter's lifestyle. When the money dried up, the reality of the situation finally hit Brooke. She realized that Carter was not a prince waiting for his castle. He was a broke, lazy teenager with zero future. A few weeks after the trial, she packed her bags, took the baby, and moved back in with her parents, completely cutting Carter off. The golden child had lost his fiancé, his child, his financial safety net, and the house he felt entitled to. His perfect world had been reduced to ashes. And in his twisted mind, none of it was his fault. He blamed me for every single second of his misery. A year passed. I was 27, and life was finally beautiful. Claire and I had a private, intimate wedding with just her family and our closest friends. My business was thriving, and the settlement money sat safely in an investment account. I thought the nightmare was permanently behind me. I had blocked their numbers and moved on. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon, about a month after my wedding. I decided to take a break from my computer screens and take a stroll around my quiet suburban neighborhood to clear my head. The streets were peaceful, lined with large oak trees and manicured lawns. I was about 4 blocks away from my house when I saw him. Carter was standing on the corner of Elm Street, wearing a dirty hoodie, pacing back and forth. We had not seen each other since the courtroom. I froze, completely confused as to how he found my walking route. I called out his name, asking what the hell he was doing in my neighborhood. Carter turned around, and the look in his eyes was not human. It was pure, unadulterated, psychotic rage. He did not say a word. He just charged at me. Before my brain could process the danger, I saw the weapon. He was gripping a heavy, rusted iron rod, the kind used for reinforcing concrete on construction sites. I turned to run, but my walking shoes slipped on a patch of wet leaves. Carter swung the heavy metal rod with every ounce of his strength. The first blow caught me squarely in the ribs. The impact was deafening. I felt the bone crack instantly, and the pain shot through my torso like a bolt of lightning, stealing all the oxygen from my lungs. I collapsed onto the concrete sidewalk, gasping for air. Carter stood over me, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of hatred. He raised the rod high above his head again, aiming directly for my legs. He swung down violently. The iron collided with my left shin. I heard a horrific, wet snapping sound as the bone fractured. I screamed out in blinding agony, curling into a ball to protect my head. "You ruined my life," Carter screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Everything is ruined because of you. Dad is broke. Brooke left me. It is all your fault." I tried to crawl away, my body screaming in protest, but I was completely powerless. He swung a third time, bringing the rod down hard on my right arm as I tried to block my face. The bone shattered. The pain was so intense that my vision began to tunnel, the edges turning black. I lay there in a pool of my own blood on the suburban pavement, waiting for the fatal strike, while my brother prepared to end my life over a delusion our parents had built. I did not die on that sidewalk because a neighbor driving by saw the attack, honked their horn continuously, and jumped out of their truck. The commotion spooked Carter enough that he dropped the bloody iron rod and tried to run, but the police intercepted him 2 blocks away. When I finally woke up, the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room blinded me. I was hooked up to a terrifying amount of machinery. Claire was asleep in a chair next to my bed, her face pale and exhausted, her hand resting gently on my uninjured shoulder. The recovery was a grueling, humiliating form of torture. I had 3 fractured ribs, a completely shattered right arm held together by surgical pins, and a broken left leg encased in a heavy cast. I was bedridden for weeks. I had to rely on my new wife to help me eat, dress, and use a bedpan. Every single movement was a reminder of the monster my family had created. But while my body slowly knitted itself back together in a physical rehabilitation center, the legal system was moving swiftly. Carter had been caught red-handed, with the weapon, covered in my blood, and with multiple eyewitnesses. He was formally charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. I attended his criminal sentencing in a wheelchair, pushed into the courtroom by Claire. The prosecution presented the medical records, the photos of my shattered bones, and the police report where Carter arrogantly admitted he had stolen the rod and waited for me to punish me for ruining his life. The judge was merciless. He sentenced Carter to 5 full years in a state penitentiary, with no possibility of early parole for at least 3. But the most sickening part of that entire day was not seeing my brother in an orange jumpsuit. It was looking at the gallery behind him. Douglas and Catherine were sitting there, weeping openly. But they were not crying for me, their battered, hospitalized son. They were crying for Carter. Even after he had violently shattered my bones, they nodded along as Carter's defense attorney tried to argue that Carter was just an emotionally distressed boy who had been bullied by me. They still, in the deepest depths of their sick minds, selected him as the victim. As I was wheeled out of that courtroom, I felt nothing for them. No anger, no sadness. Just cold, absolute apathy. They were dead to me. 6 months passed. My leg had healed enough that I could walk with a slight limp, and the pins in my arm had been removed. Carter was locked in a concrete cell, and my parents had vanished into total silence. Life was finally returning to a predictable, peaceful rhythm. Claire and I even started talking about trying for a baby. Everything felt safe until a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Claire and I had a standing tradition of meeting for lunch at a little cafe near her downtown office every Tuesday to break up the work week. I secured a table by the window and ordered our drinks. 20 minutes passed. Then 40. Claire is notoriously punctual. If she is running even 2 minutes late, she sends a text. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. A creeping, icy dread started pooling in my stomach. I called her office, and her receptionist cheerfully informed me that Claire had left the building exactly on schedule to meet me. Panic completely overrode my system. I limped to my car and started driving aimlessly around the blocks between her office and the cafe, scanning the rain-soaked sidewalks, terrified she had been hit by a car. Then my cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone as I answered. The voice on the other end made the blood freeze in my veins. It was my mother. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, adopting that same sickly sweet, maternal tone she used when they tried to steal my house. "Hello, Gavin," Catherine said smoothly. "Do not worry. Your wife is with us now. We are taking her to a safe place where you cannot harm her anymore." I slammed on the brakes, pulling the car violently to the shoulder of the road. I screamed into the receiver, demanding to know what she had done. Douglas's voice echoed in the background of the call. He yelled that I had poisoned Claire's mind, that I had twisted her against the meaning of true family, and that they were acting in her best interests by taking her away to deprogram her. I realized with absolute horror what had happened. My parents had completely snapped from reality. With their golden child in prison and their bank accounts drained, their delusion had evolved into violent insanity. Catherine had used a burner phone to call Claire, pretending to be an emergency room nurse. She told Claire that I had been involved in a horrific, bloody car wreck just 2 streets over. When Claire ran out of her office in a blind panic, my parents pulled up to the curb in their silver SUV. Seeing familiar faces, Claire had jumped into their back seat to get a ride to the hospital. The moment the door shut, the child locks engaged. My parents had abducted my wife in broad daylight, fully convinced they were the heroic saviors rescuing a damsel from a villain. I did not try to negotiate with terrorists. I hung up the phone, dialed 911, and drove straight to the police precinct. I gave the detectives my parents' license plate, vehicle description, and a frantic summary of their unstable mental state. The agonizing wait in the police station felt like decades. I paced the lobby, terrified of what two desperate, delusional people might do to the woman I loved. But my parents had severely underestimated Claire. They assumed she was a fragile, submissive girl they could easily intimidate. They had driven her to a dilapidated, cheap motel on the absolute outskirts of the county, planning to keep her locked in a room until she realized the truth about me. They confiscated her phone and threw her into the filthy motel room. But they made a critical error. Douglas and Catherine stepped out into the exterior hallway to argue over who was going to drive to a nearby gas station to buy food. The second the door clicked shut, Claire sprang into action. She threw the deadbolt, locking them out. She ignored their furious pounding on the door. She went into the bathroom, smashed the small, frosted glass window with the heavy ceramic toilet tank lid, and squeezed her way out into the muddy alleyway behind the motel. She ran barefoot through the rain straight into the motel lobby and screamed at the terrified clerk to hit the emergency alarm. By the time the police cruisers swarmed the motel parking lot, Douglas and Catherine were still frantically trying to kick down the door of the empty room. They were aggressively tackled to the concrete, handcuffed, and read their rights. The police called me to the scene. When I arrived, Claire was sitting in the back of an ambulance wrapped in a blanket, shivering but completely unharmed. I held her so tightly I thought my healed ribs might crack again. As I walked her to my car, I saw my parents sitting in the back of a squad car. Catherine was pressing her face against the glass, screaming that I was the devil. Douglas just stared straight ahead, completely broken. They were formally charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and grand theft for taking Claire's purse and phone. Given their ages and the severity of the felony charges, it is highly likely they will spend the rest of their natural lives in a federal prison. It has been nearly a year since the motel incident. The nightmares have finally faded. Claire and I are safe, our business is thriving, and we are expecting our first child next spring. A little boy. I am going to make sure he never, ever feels invisible. Looking back at the wreckage of my past, I realize that blood does not make a family. Love, respect, and mutual protection make a family. My biological relatives chose their delusions over reality, and now they are paying the ultimate price in cold, steel cages. I've spent my entire life trying to figure out what I did to make them hate me so much, only to realize some people are just fundamentally broken. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, a thought creeps in. They're rotting in jail right now, completely destroyed. So, tell me, am I wrong for feeling absolutely zero guilt? Should I have handled things differently when they first showed up at my house? Thank you so much for watching and making it to the end of this crazy journey. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more shocking, real-life stories like this one. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. See you in the next video.